Japan is in serious trouble. Its population is shrinking, putting enormous pressure on its working population and government finances. If nothing changes, Japan's population will shrink by 30% over the next 5 decades. Malls, schools, and businesses will be forced to close. Government revenues will collapse, and a shrinking group of working people will have to pay higher and higher taxes to cover the cost of supporting the elderly. Simply put, Japan is facing a collapse. How did this happen? How did Japan get into this mess? And what is it going to do to get out of it? In this video, we'll answer these questions, but before we do, make sure to hit the subscribe button to get notifications on our latest videos. And if you like this video, hit the like button and help us spread the word. When we think of Japan today, we think of a trading nation that does business with the whole world. But for Japan, this sort of thing is relatively new. For much of its history, Japan was deeply isolationist, almost entirely cut off from the rest of the world. During the rule of the shoguns, powerful warriors who dominated the country's politics from the early 1600s to the mid-1800s, foreigners were banned from entering Japan except under special diplomatic circumstances. It was illegal for a Japanese person to leave the country, and it was also illegal for anyone to teach a foreigner to speak Japanese. Japan was literally and figuratively an island unto itself. All of that changed in 1853. That year, U.S. Naval Commodore Matthew Calbraith Perry sailed a fleet of American warships into the harbor at Edo, the city today known as Tokyo. Perry demanded that Japan open up trade with the United States. In those days, the U.S. often imitated European colonial powers in its approach to trade, so threatening to attack a country if they didn't trade with the U.S. was par for the course. The shogunate that ruled Japan agreed to the U.S.'s terms, but more importantly, Japan was shocked at the level of technological advancement that the U.S. had reached. While the Japanese lived on their quiet, isolated island, the world had industrialized. The Japanese realized they were far behind Europe and the US and could no longer pretend that they were strong enough to maintain their sovereignty against any outside threat. This changed the attitude in Japan entirely. Within 13 years of Commodore Perry's arrival, the shogunate that ruled Japan was overthrown, and an emperor took power in the country in what is now known as the Meiji Restoration. It was the first time in 2.5 centuries that Japan had an emperor. Under Emperor Meiji, Japan began to transform its society completely. Japanese scholars and industrialists traveled across the Pacific Ocean to San Francisco, where they observed and learned about the technologies that the West had developed. Within a few years, Japan was building railroads and factories. Mass manufacturing of goods began, and most importantly at that time, Japan began building a modern military. The memory of Commodore Perry's strong arming of Japan was fresh in people's minds, and Japan's leadership resolved never to let such a thing happen again. The days of the shoguns and their broadswords were over. The era of naval destroyers and torpedoes had begun. Japan's rise as an industrial power was so fast and so successful, it led to enormous hubris among the country's imperial leadership. Japan became increasingly aggressive on the world stage, and in 1905, it won a war against Russia. This was the first time in many centuries that a non-European power had defeated a European power in a war. It marked the rise of Japan as an imperial force in the world. Within a few years, Japan occupied Korea, and by the 1930s, its empire had expanded to include vast tracts of China as well. But as is well known, Japan's imperial ambitions came to a crashing halt in World War II, when the U.S. used nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to force Emperor Hirohito into surrender. Japan's imperial ambitions evaporated. The Japanese were adrift, their country and economy in ruins, uncertain of who they were or what they should do. But very quickly, the world reoriented around a new geopolitical situation. The Cold War between the US and the USSR had broken out. In 1950, the Korean War erupted, with North Korea backed by the USSR and Communist China, while South Korea was backed by the US and Western Europe. It was the first proxy war of the Cold War, and for Japan, it presented a huge opportunity. The US and Western forces were fighting a war far from home, and they needed supplies. Japan, being an ally of the West after World War II, was ideally situated to supply the war effort. The Japanese economy boomed as it became a major supplier of weapons and other goods to the US military in Korea. This was the beginning of Japan's rapid industrialization, but in the years to come, that industrialization would accelerate massively. In 1960, a new prime minister came to power, Hayato Ikeda. He launched what was known as the Income Doubling Plan, a program to double Japan's GDP in 10 years. To do this, Ikeda harnessed the power of Japan's recently created Ministry of Economy, Trade, and industry. The ministry began reorganizing Japan's businesses into what was called Keiretsu, giant conglomerates of manufacturers, suppliers, distributors, and sometimes even banks. The companies at the core of these Keiretsu are today familiar names: Toshiba, Hitachi, Sony, Sharp, and so on. The ministry had a plan to make these Keiretsu dominant in a new field of manufacturing, electronics. To that end, the ministry began working with a company calling itself Tokyo Telecommunications Engineering Corporation, better known today as Sony. Back in 1956, Sony had released the TR-6, the world's first portable radio, small enough to fit in a pocket. This was the trigger for Japan's multi-decade rise to prominence as a manufacturer of electronic goods. Within 3 years, there were 6 million Japanese radios in the United States. Not long after that, Japan matched the US in production of transistor-based technologies, an incredible feat considering that at the time, the US was so far ahead of the rest of the world economically that it alone was responsible for half of the world's economic output. By the late 1960s, Japan's recovery from the war was complete, and now the country focused on becoming a dominant economic power. Japanese cars, ships, and electronics flooded the world. The country that a century earlier was completely isolated from the rest of the world was now becoming a central part of a new globalized economy. By the 1980s, Japan was spending more on research and development into transistor technologies than the United States, and its products were coming to dominate the market. They had developed a reputation for being better and cheaper than their Western counterparts. This was thanks in no small part to the adoption of a philosophy among Japanese businesses called Kaizen. Kaizen is the process of constant improvement. Japanese companies tested their products relentlessly, looking for every possible way to improve their quality. Businesses also kept improving their manufacturing processes, looking for ways to maximize production and minimize waste. By the 1980s, Japan was the second largest economy in the world, and its dominance of electronics and increasingly the auto industry bred resentment in the West. By the late 1980s, U.S. politicians were openly hostile to Japan. U.S. car makers ran ads fear-mongering about Japan taking over the world if consumers didn't buy American. In a famous televised event, a group of politicians took a sledgehammer to a Toshiba boombox after the company sold technology to the Soviet Union that would make Soviet submarines quieter and harder for the U.S. to detect. But the fear that Japan would take over would soon come to an end because Japan's economic miracle was about to come crashing down. By late 1989, Japan had built up a massive asset bubble. As Japanese exports soared, so did the value of the Japanese yen. Japan's currency became so overvalued that at the time, a cup of coffee in Tokyo cost 10 times what it costs in the US. The soaring value of the yen threatened to make Japanese exports uncompetitive on the global market, so the country's central bank, the Bank of Japan, began a campaign of monetary easing. It lowered interest rates and began printing money in order to reduce the cost of the yen on the global exchange markets. But low interest rates and a flood of new money did something else too. It massively inflated the price of assets. In 1989, Japan's real estate was worth $18 trillion, about 4 times as much as all the real estate in the US. We're talking about a country with a land area about the same as California. The grounds of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo alone were estimated to be worth more than all the real estate in California or Canada. On the first day of trading in 1990, the bubble burst and stocks and house prices began collapsing. The Bank of Japan realized its mistake and reversed course. It raised interest rates and began a policy of monetary tightening, but it was too late. The bubble had already formed and burst, and now those high interest rates were just making things worse. Companies began to go out of business, households went bankrupt, and the stock market lost half its value within 8 months. On the last day of trading in 1989, the Tokyo Stock Exchange's Nikkei index was at a level near 39,000. To this day, it has never recovered that peak. The 1990s were so brutal that the Japanese to this day call it the lost decade. But in the 1990s, things were changing rapidly. The computer and internet revolutions had begun, but unlike in earlier eras, Japan didn't react quickly and didn't aim for dominance in this new field. As innovation shifted from hardware to software, Japan was left behind. Think about the big Japanese brands that have dominated over the past half a century: Sony, Toshiba, Honda. These are all manufacturers of mechanical devices like TVs, Walkmans, and cars. In the age of software, Japan fell far behind. Something else was changing too. Globalization was leading to the decentralization of supply chains. The opening up of shipping routes around the world made it possible for companies to produce different components of their products in different places, wherever it was cheapest or most efficient. You could mine the minerals for a new phone in Latin America, have the microchips produced in Thailand, and have the phone assembled in China. This kind of decentralization decentralization didn't work with the Keiretsu system that Japan had set up, where everything was concentrated in the hands of a few companies that had long-term relationships with each other. The Keiretsu were large and complicated, and they couldn't compete with the nimble new global supply chains that were producing consumer goods. Japan also didn't seem to take much notice of its neighbors who were busy developing their own economies. It was long a part of Japan's culture to look down on neighboring countries like China and Korea, and when these countries became serious competitors for Japan, the country's leadership was arrogant and dismissive about it. By the 1990s, South Korea was producing more semiconductors than Japan. The age of Japanese dominance was over, and today, any hope Japan has at regaining its status as an economic superpower is fading because of yet another problem the country failed to address: its demographics. Simply put, Japan isn't having enough babies to keep the country running. In the 1950s, there were on average 3 children born for every woman in Japan. In the 1970s, as the cost of living in Japan grew and more women entered the workforce, the birth rate fell below 2 children per woman, below the level needed to keep the population stable. Japan's population peaked in 2009 at around 128 million, and it has been falling ever since, and that decline is accelerating. In 2022, the country's birth rate hit an all-time low of 1.36 children per woman. The population projections for Japan are disastrous. If current trends continue, Japan's population will have shrunk by 20 million people to 107 million by 2040. By 2050, it will have 97 million people, and by 2070, it will have 87 million people. With so few children born, Japan's population is aging rapidly. The median age of the country is 49. That means half of the population is above the age of 49. That's the highest median age of any country in the world, except for Monaco, which is less a country and more a city that's a playground for retired rich people. There are many explanations as to why this has happened. There's the fact that the cost of living in Japan has soared, making child rearing expensive. There's the fact that women have entered the workforce, reducing the amount of time they have for children and creating worries that their careers will fall behind if they become mothers, or that they will be stuck doing most of the work while men continue going to the office and working. In all likelihood, all these factors have played some part in Japan's collapsing birth rate. But whatever the reasons, the situation makes a Japanese economic recovery practically impossible. As an even larger share of the population moves into retirement, a shrinking group of working people will have to hand over more and more of their income through higher taxes to take care of the elderly. Businesses are unable to find young workers to replace older ones. Between 1995 and 2021, the working age population of Japan shrank by 14% as older workers retired. Companies have no choice but to move overseas to find labor, reducing the economic opportunities available to people in Japan. The situation is so dire that earlier this year, Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida warned that the country is on the brink of not being able to maintain its societal functions. Kishida said, "Japan is standing on the verge of whether we can continue to function as a society. Focusing attention on policies regarding children and child rearing is an issue that cannot wait and cannot be postponed." And indeed, Japan is now busily reforming policies with the goal of convincing people to have more children. It's increasing childcare funding by the equivalent of $25 billion per year, and it's planning to boost the payments the country offers to young parents. Those payments are small compared to the cost of raising a child in Japan. Parents of children under the age of 3 receive around $107 per month, and parents of children aged 4 to 15 receive about $65 per month. In a country that's as expensive as Japan, that's a pittance. The new plans involve expanding benefits so that they cover children all the way through high school and increasing the amount parents are paid, though the new amount hasn't yet been set by the government. There are also plans to make meals free in schools and to cover the costs of childbirth under the country's universal health insurance system. But will it work? That's a hard question to answer. Japan isn't the only country that is trying to incentivize childbirth these days. Lots of countries are dealing with falling birth rates, and some of them have had success with paying people to have children. Take, for instance, Russia. In the late 1990s, its birth rate fell to 1.25 children per woman, and today it has bounced back to around 1.8. But in Russia, childbirth incentives are much more generous, amounting to nearly $200 per month per child. That's nearly double Japan's level in a country where the cost of living is much lower than in Japan. Last year, Russia launched an even more ambitious plan to give a medal and $16,000 to any woman who has 10 or more children. The idea is not only to pay for children, but to make women who have children children come to be seen as heroes. Will it work? It's unlikely many women will have 10 children in order to get a medal and $16,000. But you only need a small share of women to do it to seriously boost your birth rate. Still, Russia's example makes one thing clear. To convince people to have children, Japan's benefits will need to be a lot more generous. And even that might not be enough. The one thing that's certain is that as birth rates fall in countries around the world, people will be looking to Japan to see a glimpse of their own future. If you like this video, be sure to hit the like button and help us spread the word. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for notifications on all our latest news and analysis. In the meantime, check out one of these videos here to learn more. Thanks for watching.